Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to MEFA's webinar, College Financing. My name is Julie Shields-Rutina, and I am the Director of College Planning, Education, and Training at MEFA. And we are thrilled to have your presenter this evening, Amy Staffier, who is the Assistant Vice President of Enrollment, Student Services, and Director of Financial Aid at Simmons University. And I think some of you may know Amy from past presentations, but she is definitely an expert on this topic and has a wonderful way of delivering it. So I think this webinar will be really great this evening. I'll just go through a few housekeeping items and then we'll move right into the presentation. So if you would like to ask questions this evening, and you're certainly welcome to, we would love that. Please ask them in the Q&A section. I'll be monitoring that behind the scenes, and then I'll ask questions of Amy. But it's nice if they're all in there and not also in the chat, so I can keep track of what I've answered and what I'm asking. So that would be wonderful. Put your questions in the Q&A. If you would like a live transcript, you can click on that and see the words across the screen. And we are recording this session, so we will send that to you tomorrow along with the slides. When I stop talking and Amy begins, I will put the slides in the chat for you to download, but I will tell you that when we've done that the last few webinars, there are some people who have chatted back to me and said I can't see the slides. And it might have something to do with the browser or how you logged in. So I would just say if you can't get the slides, just know they will be coming to you tomorrow. And I'll just lastly say a word about MEFA. If you don't know us well, we have a not-for-profit organization here in Massachusetts. We've been around since 1982. We have the state's college savings plans. We have low-cost loans for families who need that type of financing. And everything else we do is we give free guidance at whatever stage your child or student is at toward the transition after high school to college and career. And so we do that in many ways, and one of them is holding webinars like this. And all of our webinars can be found at mefa.org/events. So please visit us often. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy to get started with the evening.
Thank you, Julie. So just a little agenda. We will go over the types and sources of financial aid. We'll review the application process and how that varies at each school. Talk about how financial aid decisions are made. Learn about paying that college bill, and then, of course, provide free resources at the end. I always kind of joke that, during these presentations, whether I'm doing them in person or virtual, so often the answer that you might hear me say to a question is, it depends. And that really is a very honest answer, because as you'll see when I go through and talk about whether it's the application process or awarding, particularly on the institutional side, it's going to depend on the institution oftentimes. So you will hear that throughout the presentation, as well as answering questions. So first we'll talk about the types and sources of financial aid. But let's start with the basic kind of what is financial aid and defining that. It is simply money to help students and parents really pay for college. And it comes out of three buckets. So first we have grant and scholarship aid. So that's gift money or free money, right? Does not need to be repaid. And then there is federal work study. And that is something, in my 25-year career in financial aid, that is always something that causes some confusion around, why is that considered financial aid? How does that play into, helping to pay the bill or things like that? So here I'll just say that it's considered financial aid because it is actually money from the government that they allot to an institution directly. and the institution uses that funding to help pay a student for a job. I can talk more when we look at sample financial aid awards, specifically about work study and how that can be helpful. And then the third bucket is student loans. So that is money that kind of helps go towards the bill, but then would have to be repaid at a later date. Where is this funding coming from? It comes from, about 4 different sources. So we have the federal government. They have some grants. You may have heard of the federal Pell Grant. That's really the main grant that the federal government has. You may have heard of that kind of in the news. It is for our lowest income families across the United States. And I like to put this information out there that, typically students, and probably about 90% of students who are receiving a Pell Grant come from families of 50,000 or less. That doesn't mean that there aren't grants and scholarships available from other sources, but I just like to set that kind of stage for that federal Pell Grant. They have the work study program. There are federal loans, and then there are some tax incentives that you can take advantage of, for the amounts that you have paid in tuition. There's a certain rebate on that. If you're looking for some additional information, studentaid.gov is the federal website that has a host of information federally, as well as where you can get to one of the forms that we will talk about. And I will say the federal government has done a pretty good job of continually working on making that information, as well as the forms, really easily digestible for families. So that's a great resource. The state of Massachusetts also has some financial aid available in the form of some grants, some scholarships, and as well as some tuition waivers at public institutions. Loans, and I hesitate to fully talk about that or to put that out there as, oh, the state of Massachusetts has, loan programs similar to what the government has. They have a loan program that is money that is allocated to an institution, but not every institution has access to that money. I currently work at Simmons and have been there for the past 3.5 years. I was at Harvard undergraduate for about 21 years. We had access to the Massachusetts loan program, and we only had about $30,000. And I've been trying to see if we can have access to some money at Simmons, but we don't have it. So I just don't want you to think that there's some sort of guarantee that every institution has the same access to particular funding. With the grants, that is specific to the student. It's very similar to the Pell Grant, the Massachusetts State Grant. It's based on their expected family contribution, which we'll talk about in filling out the FAFSA form, and it follows the student. The loans, that's something separate. Down here on the bottom of the screen, college and university, so institutional aid. A student may not be eligible for, say, a federal grant or Massachusetts State Grant, but they may be eligible for funding through the college or university themselves. And quite honestly, a significant amount of dollars actually comes out of the universities themselves. So if you look at or hear that figure, that 50,000 or less, please don't be disappointed. There's a lot of funding that is available at the institutional level. So grants, scholarships. I would say oftentimes the word grant is related to a way of funding, which is need-based. So that funding is given based on financial need. And we will talk about what that and how that is determined. And scholarships oftentimes are related to merit-based aid, which again, we'll talk about in a slide. But again, those are both free money dollars. And then some institutions may have loan funding available. Similar to the state of Massachusetts and what I said in the beginning, it depends on the institution. It really does. Some institutions may have funding available. It may be robust. Some institutions may have some funding available, and it might be just for emergency situations. And then some institutions may not have any of their own institutional loan dollars. And then other agencies, these we typically call outside scholarships. These may be through organizations like a Lions Club or a Kiwanis Club. Oftentimes, and a great resource for students, particularly if they're in high school, is to speak with their guidance office. Because many times we see students coming with dollars that they earned kind of through the high school or the community that they live in. So there are also outside scholarships that are outside of the community that might be larger. If you want to do research or have your student to research on those, MEFA Pathways has a search on their website. Additionally, FastWeb is one that has been around for a long time. It really has taken out the research work that, years ago students would have to do in a library, and all of the information for these scholarships is within, this website. And the student typically is building a profile about themselves, which helps determine, are they eligible potentially to apply for these scholarships? Some of the feedback I've received from students is just that if the criteria to be eligible to apply is very basic, let's say you have to be a Massachusetts resident, that there's a lot of applications to go through and decisions to make. And so the question comes up, is it worth the work to apply for all of these scholarships? I'm going to answer that question when we look at some sample financial aid awards, because I think it will be a better place to see how it can be worth the work. So first, a little bit of information about federal direct student loans, which is one of the components of financial aid. I'm not going to go too far into the details because this is really, setting the stage for a lot of information that will be to come. And there, I don't want to overwhelm, but federal student loans, the student is the sole borrower. So, and there is no credit check or anything. A student doesn't even have to have a credit history in order to borrow these. They simply have to fill out the FAFSA form, which is the federal form to apply for financial aid. There are two versions of this loan that a student might be eligible for. One is subsidized, which means that the interest is being paid by the government. It's subsidized during the time the student is enrolled. Typically, a student goes into repayment on their loans 6 months after graduation. I say typically because if a student decides to withdraw from college completely or take a leave of absence, so let's say something happens halfway through their fall term of their sophomore year, and they decide, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to come back the following fall. If that leave is 6 months or greater, they would go into repayment on their loans. But if they return to school, they can defer that. And so they would no longer have to make payments. But the kind of standard, if a student is enrolled fall, spring, it would be once they graduate and then 6 months after that they go into repayment. Currently, for the current year, the interest rate is 3.73%. It is a fixed interest rate. Each year, that interest rate is reset based on a T-bill plus a certain amount. And it's usually in July or end of June that it is set for a July 1st. But each year that you borrow, whatever that interest rate is fixed for that particular loan. So someone who is in school right now has borrowed, the interest rate on that loan is 3.73 and will remain that for the life of the loan. They borrow in the next year, that particular amount that they borrow, would be the interest rate that was set as of that July 1st going into that year. There are no payments due while a student is enrolled. if a student decides to make payments at any point in time, there are no penalties or fees, or if they wanted to pay the whole loan off. You can see on the right-hand side, there are annual limits. So there is a limit to what a student is allowed to borrow through the federal loan program. And you can see that it is not a super large amount. Oftentimes we hear stories of students who have, been straddled with, exorbitant amounts of student loan debt. It is not from these undergraduate federal loans. That is really when a student ends up taking on, additional private loans to try and make up for, what they're able to pay and a cost, or graduate school loans where oftentimes there's less, grant funding available. If you look here, the third kind of bullet point, if a student borrowed these maximums, so borrowed the maximum each year, they would come out with $27,000 in federal debt, which is about a $300 monthly payment based on a 10-year repayment. I have done the research. I've looked at, what is a student coming out, average salary coming out in, 2019, 2020, and it was about $50,000, which a $300 payment is well in the, where they say, not more than 8 to 10% of gross income should your loan payments be, and that's well below that. There are lots of options with federal loans to defer. So if a student goes on to graduate school, or if they are in a situation where they don't qualify for a deferment, but they're having some sort of economic, hardship, they could qualify for a forbearance where they might not have to make payments, but interest still accrues, or maybe it's a lesser monthly payment. So the government has a whole host of options available to students, as well as forgiveness opportunities as well if students go into, say, public service. The next two slides are talking about the way that financial aid is awarded. And I somewhat alluded to this when we were looking at where aid is coming from. This slide first, we'll talk about merit-based aid. So this is a way of awarding to a student because of a particular reason. So it might be based on their academic profile. So what the admission office sees in their admission application. It could be, depending on the school, right? It could be an athletic reason, artistic, or maybe, a student's a super oboe player and the school needs to fill that within their band. But there's some reason that the student is awarded that aid. Typically, a student should know, what they're receiving, why they're receiving it, and then are there any requirements in order to retain that scholarship in another year, and is it even renewable? So that should all be clearly stated in any letter that a student gets in regard to being awarded that scholarship. I know that in my own institution, sometimes I joke about the fact that the font size is pretty small. They try and keep it, I feel like, on one page. But it really is important to read through those details because oftentimes, you might have to, let's say if it's academic, you might have to maintain a certain GPA in order to receive that award in another year. I would also point out, and this is just, kind of a tidbit from my day-to-day life, but, let's say a student had a requirement they needed to be enrolled continuously in the 4 years to retain their merit scholarship. And let's say that student had, a medical issue and they had to take, a semester off in order to recover. I always encourage, students and people that, I speak with, hey, reach out to, whether it's the admission office or the financial aid office and see if there is, an appeal process. So if there's something that's really out of the student's control from, being able to keep that award, there might be a process in place where you can appeal given special circumstances. So that's my little nugget on merit-based aid. Just kind of looking at these bullet points here, it could be that there's a separate application. It's always important, and I know there's a slide where we talk about deadlines and looking at the websites of the different institutions. That is so important. I cannot stress enough. Every institution is different. It's not cookie cutter. With federal aid, we have the same formula is used, the same form is used. But when you look at institutional aid and how that is awarded, it can vary greatly by school. Every school has or might have a different way in which of doing things. At my own institution right now, we have merit-based aid that there isn't a separate application. Just in putting your admission application in, you're considered for this pool of merit funds, and many schools are similar. But there also is kind of our top tier merit that is full tuition fees, room, board, some additional funding for research and such. And that has a separate application, a very distinct deadline that is in December. And so you want to make sure that you have looked at each and every institution that your student, and do it with your child. I have the benefit of having a senior this year as well. So it's interesting having gone through this just on one side for so many years, but now going at it, along with my child is very interesting. But good to sit down and do that together and really make sure that you have looked at all of the information that's provided from the institutions that you're considering. So the other way of awarding aid is based on need. So it's really looking at the family finances and a student's kind of financial eligibility, and that often is defined as need. Excuse me. So this second bullet point, and I think I've said this for over 20 years of doing this presentation. As it gets changed each year, that bullet point remains. Eligibility determined by a standardized formula. Yes, the federal formula is a standard formula, but again, I just like to point out that each institution, in awarding their own institutional funding, you might see something that is slightly different as far as the expected family contribution. And I'm not necessarily saying that it's greater. There are two different forms that you might need to fill out. One that some schools use for determining their institutional eligibility, but any sort of federal aid, any sort of state aid needs to be determined by the federal formula. So that is standard. Need-based aid includes grants and includes loan funding as well as work study. And I would say a good majority of aid is based on need. The last bullet point is something important to point out, that students, in order to retain their financial aid from year to year, or a school may do semester to semester, a student needs to maintain what's called satisfactory academic progress. This may be determined by the institution. They may have their own determination of kind of satisfactory progress in academics. But when it's related to financial aid, there are standards that the government has put into place. And it's basically that a student by the end of their sophomore year has to at least be at a 2.0 in order to retain their financial aid. There's also a PACE component with that. So basically, is the student progressing in a way that they'll be able to graduate, within not 4 years, but really more, like about 6 years. So that is something that, you may see verbiage about, so it's good to point out ahead of time. I'm going to move on to the application process. So I mentioned the fact of deadlines and such. Not every institution is going to be asking for the same information. The federal form, the FAFSA form, which we will talk about, really every institution is going to be looking for that, because to apply for any sort of federal aid, and it may be required for institutional, you'll need to fill that out. So that is probably a standard right at any institution. But an institution may also require this, what's called the CSS Profile form. It's very similar to the FAFSA, but it asks a whole lot more of more information, more questions. And I'm going to have some specific slides where we'll talk about those two forms. And so we'll go into what those differences are. And an institution may also ask for copies of tax returns up front, or business returns if you have a business. So again, it's really important to know what each institution is looking for and expecting, and also knowing what their deadline is, so that you're not missing that. I have worked in institutions where, we've been fairly generous, where we will take applications past a deadline, but I've also been involved in conversations with colleagues across universities where, they're very stuck on that deadline, and they have a limited pot of money, and they may not be able to award something to a student who submits that application late. So it really, really is important to make sure that you're meeting those financial aid deadlines. Early action, some institutions may have a deadline that is that might align with that kind of early action admission application deadline. Some institutions may still have you be submitting your information, say in February. Again, it really depends on each institution and what they do. MEFA has an application manager to help stay organized. I'm the type of person I love. Everyone knows who knows me, like I'm a list maker. For me, I love paper and, creating my little boxes and being able to check them off. But certainly, an online tool is super helpful, and it helps guide you to just fill in the information for each institution and what deadline, what forms, and all of that. So that can be helpful. So I've referenced the FAFSA form already. This is the federal form that basically any student who is applying for aid is going to need to complete. It's the FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. I think we have gotten rid of all of the sites out there that charge students. So there used to be a FAFSA.com, and it used to charge students or families to complete the FAFSA form. But the federal government actually ended up buying that domain after a number of years. So I don't think that exists, but we always still like to point that out, that it is free, required by all colleges. It just opened on October 1st for the upcoming 22-23 year. So if your child is a senior in high school this year, you can go ahead and complete that form, as of October 1st. So right now, FAFSA.gov is the website. That's going to get you right to the form, to this screenshot that you see on the right-hand side of my screen. It could be the left-hand side for you. So you can either complete the form on the web at FAFSA.gov, or the little graphic underneath the FAFSA.gov, FSA. So My Student Aid, if you search My Student Aid in the App Store, that is an app that you can download. You can complete the FAFSA through that app. The student and the parent can separately download that onto their phones. They can complete that separately and have them sync up. Additionally, what I always like to do is, this came out about 3 years ago. I downloaded it. I've used it myself just in kind of testing, because if I'm going to talk to students and families about it, I want to make sure that, it was easy to use and it was helpful. One of the things that I really like about the app is that there is a spot, so you can do more than just complete the FAFSA. There's a spot where you can log in as a student or a parent to view your student loans. To be able to have that information right there, at your thumb, I guess, or finger, is really helpful, because you know that you can track, or the student can track, hey, how much have I borrowed? Who's my lender? Who do I need to get in touch with? And then once they are in repayment, even more helpful to have that right there at the touch of your finger. In order to complete the FAFSA form, whether you're doing it in the app or on the desktop, you need an FSA ID. And actually, the student needs their own FSA ID, FSA standing for Federal Student Aid, and at least one parent needs an FSA ID, because it's signed by the student and one parent. In the next slide, we're going to talk through, who is considered a parent. But getting that FSA ID, you can do at fsaid.ed.gov. That's something that you can do right away, sign up for. And it takes, a couple of days just to do some verification. But this is really your electronic signature, not only for the FAFSA, but for a student, it becomes an electronic signature on any federal loans they borrow. And the same if a parent decided to borrow a federal parent loan, they would use that same FSA ID to complete an application, sign a promissory note, and such. MEFA does have a webinar recording that really goes into depth just on the FAFSA line by line. I know I actually did one of those presentations recently, and we really went line by line. At the end, we'll talk about some free resources, because there are some upcoming live events that will allow you to kind of on the spot ask some questions as well. But there are also our recordings. It does need to be completed every year, which I know, oftentimes when I've done this presentation, someone will say, oh, do I have to complete it every year? And they're looking at me in anticipation that they don't have to, but unfortunately they do. Some information is pre-populated. And actually, if you have two students, like let's say you have a set of twins or someone who's a first year in college and, like a sophomore in college, when you're completing as the parent, you actually can transfer data to another FAFSA. So, makes it slightly easier. So what is reported on the FAFSA? There's a lot of just demographic information, and it starts off asking that demographic information about the student. And it is also very important to realize that on the FAFSA form, it is written toward the student. So it will say, what is your name? What is your email address, right? And that it always remember that you or your is you, the student. It will then get into questions. What is your parent's name? And so when, oftentimes a parent is filling that out, but just remember that it is written toward the student being the one completing it. It's looking at ask questions about student citizenship status, because a student does need to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident in order to be eligible for federal financial aid. If a parent is a non-citizen, as long as the student is a citizen, they are eligible for federal funding. As far as the parent is concerned, to be able to complete the FAFSA, there is a question that the parent has to put in their social security number. You can bypass that by putting in all zeros. And a parent who's a non-citizen would not be able to get an FSA ID, but there is an option to print a signature page and actually, do a wet signature and mail that in. You're going to put the colleges where the student is applying. There are 10 spots where students can put, up to 10 schools that they're applying to. I have had the question over the years, what if I'm applying to more than 10 schools? Well, I would prioritize just by deadline first. Schools will get the information in about 3 days electronically from the FAFSA. So a student can go back into the FAFSA and make a correction. They can remove a school off of the list and add a school on, and then submit. And now that new institution is also going to get that FAFSA data. So that's how you deal with, if it's more than 10 schools. I've also had questions where, oh, we haven't finalized the list. I mean, I know definitely that they want to apply to this one school, but we're not really sure, can I still complete the FAFSA? Absolutely, you can still complete it with just one school. You have to at least designate one school, but a student can 100% go back in days, weeks, months later, and add a school, and that institution is going to then electronically get that information. I always say, at the end of the day, just make sure that whatever institution the student decides that they are going to attend, make sure that school is still listed on the FAFSA form. So the question of who is considered a parent on this form. So if parents are married, including same-sex parents, both parents' information is included as far as demographic and financial. All parents who live together, whether or not they are married. So there are some instances with two biological parents and they live together, but they've just never been married. It used to be a number of years ago, actually, that you basically had to pick one of these parents to put on the FAFSA form, but the government made some significant clarifications on this probably 6 or more years ago. So both of those parents should be reported on the FAFSA. In the case of divorced or separated parents, it is the custodial parent. And how that is currently defined is who does the student live with more? Whoever they live with more, it is that parent's information that should be listed on the FAFSA. If that parent is remarried, they are to include their spouse's information as well. This isn't always the most popular thing that I will say in a presentation, and I understand that, but that is the rules that are set forward by the Department of Education. If in a divorced or separated situation, and I've had this happen where it says, well, the student lives equally with both parents, then the government says, so the Department of Education says, well, then who provides more support for the student? That is who should be on the FAFSA. I will say there have been some significant changes that were put into place, I believe, around December of last year, that went into law and said these changes need to go into effect on the FAFSA starting in 23 year, although they've been pushed out even farther to a year later. So I think about 24, 25 year. I just bring this up because one of the changes is around who is the parent on the FAFSA. And so they have stopped, they will stop in that 24, 25 year of saying it's whoever they live with more. And the baseline is who provides more support. That parent's information is to be the one on the FAFSA. And then legal guardians or a grandparent, they are not considered a parent on here. There can be special circumstances where a student maybe has no communication with a parent, can't provide parent information. That's something where you actually just need to reach out to the individual schools. There are processes in place. And unfortunately, in those situations, particularly in this year where you might be applying to multiple schools, you'll have to reach out to each individual office to find out about what sort of waiver process they use for waiving parent information. It's also going to ask about the number of people living in the household, the student's household, and how many of those children, because a parent doesn't count, but how many of those children will be in college? because those data points affect the calculation for the output on the FAFSA, which is the expected family contribution. So demographic information, and then we get into financial information. So for parents and students who, again, are a senior this year, and they will be a first-year student in the 22-23 year. So the FAFSA that just opened this October 1st is for that 22-23 year. It will be asking about information in the year 2020. So the nice thing is, hopefully, right, your taxes for 2020 are done and you have that information on hand. It used to be that it would have been asking for like 2021 income. It used to be that it was the year that would be ending, which was so challenging for students and families in your position where your student is a senior. You might be trying to complete this and you don't have your taxes done. So it's really nice that the Department of Education has made that change. So it's going to be looking at 2020 income, and that's both tax income, so off the FAFSA, excuse me, the your 1040, and potentially some untaxed income, certain untaxed income, so money that might go into a retirement account and such. It also asks about parent and student assets. You first answer income questions, and then there's a figure that it will present to you. Are your assets over, X amount? And if you say no, then you're not required to answer asset questions. If you say yes, then you just need to provide the information about your assets. This would be cash, savings, checking account, include all 529 accounts. So if you have a college savings account, and you should be including that as a parent asset, because a 529 college savings account is owned by the parent. If the parent is the one that set it up, it could be a grandparent, right? But it's not a student asset. They are a beneficiary. And that actually is a benefit because assets of the parent are assessed at a lower rate than the student, about 5%, where on the student side it's about 20% that kind of goes into the financial aid formula. As far as assets, you do not include your primary home value. So that is not included as an asset unless the primary home you're living in is also like a rental property. So let's say it was a 3-family, then it would be about 2/3 would be an asset and 1/3 would not. You do not include the value of your retirement accounts. But again, as far as untaxed income is concerned, if you took money from your paycheck and we're putting that into a retirement account, that amount would be included as untaxed income. On the asset side, you do not report life insurance or the value of a small family business, and the Department of Education has defined that as a business of 100 employees or less. And then debt is nowhere reported on the form, except debt against, reported assets, obviously. But, sometimes I'll get questions, oh, where can we report, we have X amount in credit cards or this or that, but that is not asked about at all on the FAFSA form. So I mentioned that some institutions may require students to provide and complete a separate application, which is called the CSS Profile. You may have heard of, CSS, the College Scholarship Service, administers like the SATs and such. So as I mentioned, this form is somewhat similar to the FAFSA in that it is asking some demographic information, it is asking some financial information, but there are some differences. So one of the largest differences is that there is a cost associated. And so it is $25 for the first school that you're sending it to, and then $16 to each additional school. Kind of breaking news for this year is that the College Board has made it that any family with making 100,000 or less, actually, there's a waiver on that cost. So that is a huge change, and I think that was a very welcome. I was on a meeting call yesterday where this was being discussed, and all of the institutions were just, really happy for that change. It's only required by some colleges and universities. I believe the number is around, 230 to 240 or so institutions. So you can find that information on the College Board's website, but you can also find that, and should find that, really on each institution that you are applying to, or your child is applying to, on their website, whether or not they require the profile. It also becomes available October 1st. For divorced or separated families, the profile itself is completed by the kind of custodial parent, but there is a non-custodial parent application. That information is not seen by either side. So like the custodial parent or student cannot see what the non-custodial parent has submitted, and likewise. In completing the profile, information about the non-custodial parent is collected, and then they are sent information, and it's a completely separate form. So the only one who is seeing that actually is at the institutional level. A financial aid, administrator is going to see that information. But that non-custodial parent is providing information about their household finances, etc. There is a profile webinar recording, and there may be some additional live ones that you might want to go to. That's really like a deep dive into the profile. So you can find that at mefa.org/events. It is rare, but there are instances where a college may have their own financial aid application. I always think back to when I used to do these presentations in person, which, at some point we will get back to that. But I've had, families or students come up to me and ask, oh, can you help me with this? Or I've offered that within my own town. And there was a young girl and her family that I was meeting with, and she had told me like the schools that she was thinking of applying to. And I, being this kind of checklist person, was already looking at these institutions and what was it that they required. And so when I sat with them at their house and was going through stuff, I had said, oh, did you submit the school application for, X college? And they were blown away. They didn't even realize that there was, an institutional application. So again, really important to make sure you're looking at what is required for each and every institution, and make sure you're getting that in. I do think it's rather rare that these are still out there, but they may exist. I know when I came to Simmons, there was an institutional application, and I've since gotten rid of it because it just feels like a stumbling block and not something that was providing us much additional information that helped in the process. So, all right. So after you have applied, these are some of the things that are going to happen. The colleges that you have listed on the FAFSA, as well as the profile, because it's very similar that it gets to institutions electronically, they're going to receive that information. And as I've said, it takes about 3 days because there are checks. So where I mentioned a student has to be a US citizen or permanent resident in order to be eligible for federal financial aid, when the FAFSA is submitted, there are these checks that go on for certain things like citizenship. So they check with the Social Security office, is a student a citizen, and verify that. The student is going to receive what's called a student aid report. This is really just a listing of everything that was on the FAFSA. It also provides additional information, whether or not you were selected. This is the fourth bullet point for a process called verification, and I'll talk about that. It will tell you what your expected family contribution is, so the calculation that was done based on the information that was provided. And then if there's anything else that you might need to follow up on, talk about citizenship, right? Let's say they weren't able to verify that you're a citizen. I've had situations where a student said, I'm a citizen, and it said, oh, we weren't able to verify that. Well, actually, they were a permanent resident, right? And it's actually that check is done by 2 separate organizations. So then it becomes the job of the institution to collect documentation to verify, oh, yes, this student is a citizen or permanent resident. And then, excuse me, if you have any particular special circumstances, right? 2020 is the financial data that is required to be on the tax return. But here we are in 2021 and pretty far into it. So maybe you as a family don't look financially how you did in 2020. And so you can reach out to institutions and ask, is there a process where, you can look at what my current state is? Is there an appeal process? Be ready if you're in a situation like that you have a letter, especially if you are communicating or, applying to multiple schools. Each one of them has a process, and some will grant, an appeal, and some may not. I always say, even though I'm on the receiving end of it, ask if you feel like, gosh, this doesn't seem to fit what my family is able to afford, or we have special circumstances, whether it's a job loss, God forbid, a death, medical situation, medical costs, helping to support, grandparents of the student, things like that. You can reach out again to the institution. There's nothing that you can put in that FAFSA form itself. On the profile, there actually is a box where you can put in some additional information, but I'm 100% most institutions are going to be asking for, a letter and documentation, because that's, we get audited every year on our funding, and we need to be able to provide that sort of documentation if we're making changes to certain data elements. We're going to, as a college, we're going to review the applications and determine what sort of, financial aid package we're going to provide the student that we're able to. I talked about this being selected for verification. This is a random process that happens through, the Department of Education, where they select an applications and say to the institution, you need to verify certain data elements, which are, AGI, taxes paid, certain untaxed income, and then household size and number in college. You may need to, in this first year, be providing that information to each institution. Once again, every institution is different, and I can look to my own experience where at my past institution, we used to do verification after the fact when the student was already, in school, but that was likely due to the fact that we had institutional funds that, should we not be able to award federal, we would be able to kind of cover with institutional. At the institution I'm at now, and like many institutions, they're likely going to want to perform verification upfront before they give an award, or they give you an estimate and say that they need verification before that May 1st kind of deposit deadline. So we do that where we provide an estimate, but we say this is an estimate and we need to perform verification and collect some documents. What would they be requesting? Tax return, a verification worksheet, which the verification worksheet is really just restating who's in the household, who's in college. A tax return, a signed tax return, or the family can use, there's something called a data retrieval tool. So when you're completing the FAFSA, you can actually opt to pull the certain data elements in right from the IRS. And in theory, you're less likely to be selected for verification because that serves as verification of that particular information. Make sure you are reviewing and responding to any communications that the institution sends out. That's very important. And you know, some institutions might have a portal that the student has to log into. And so just, and the other thing, which is, you know, is very much something that you have to get used to, you know, as you kind of get into those college years, is the communication is mostly all going to the student. And once they are in college, even the bill, and it's always something that can be a little bit shocking, you know, to parents. Oftentimes you can get set up as, you know, a third party to be able to receive those billing statements, but they do go to the student. Things that you might want to ask the financial aid office. So what is it, you've received a financial aid package, what does this look like in a different year? Is this fully renewable? If it's based on need, you know, what kind of changes might I see? The treatment of outside scholarships, we are required to incorporate any outside sources of aid into a financial aid package. That's a federal requirement that we must follow. But every institution might have a different way of doing that, whether there's some unmet need that it would go towards, or reducing loans, or things like that. I mentioned about the 24-25 FAFSA changes. You know, might that be something that, you know, might change my financial aid package that I've received now? I talked about special circumstances and speaking directly with the financial aid office about, and maybe it's that, you know, in another year that there's going to be changes, you know, coming, just to know, am I able to appeal, and what does that process look like? The financial aid office is always available, you know, phone, email. Some of them might have chat features as well. But I always encourage families, you know, to ask questions, that there's never, you know, a dumb question. Sometimes I get that, oh, this is a stupid question. Absolutely not. Most of you are going through this for the first time. Even if you're going through it for the second time, every institution is different. Ask those questions. And we're always happy to provide answers. So how decisions are made. So there's a very basic formula here. You take the cost of attendance, and the cost of attendance is made up of billed or direct expenses, and that's in blue. So those would be tuition and fees, room and board. So you're going to get an actual bill for those. Room and board, as long as the student is living on campus, right? And then non-billed or indirect expenses. These would be things like books and supplies, transportation, personal expenses. So you are not billed for those kind of yellow expenses or costs, but this cost of attendance serves a few purposes. One, it is giving a student and family a better sense of what does 1 year, right, of college actually cost. And two, this cost of attendance is helping generate need, which we fill with financial aid. The indirect non-billed expenses, it does not mean that those are the exact amounts that you might be spending. Sometimes I feel like in my own, you know, cost of attendance, I feel like that's pretty high, that what the allowance we kind of give as far as transportation is concerned. So then you take a cost of attendance and you're going to subtract the expected family contribution. I've mentioned this a few times. This is output from completing the FAFSA form. Rather than thinking of it as this, you know, family contribution, it's a little bit better to think about it as, you know, what a family might be able to absorb for 1 year of college costs, because it does not always mean that you can take that right out, you know, and pay that amount, you know, right out of pocket. But maybe it's part of it is in borrowing, and what, you know, in this formula the Department of Education, you know, has what a family can absorb of 1 year of college costs. That second bullet point, just bring it up again. It's the same federal formula, but institutions, if they use the profile, they might have an AFC that's generated from that profile. Sometimes that can be lower than that federal, expected family contribution. So I don't want, families to think that, oh, the profile, that means it's gonna be higher, or there's gonna be less aid. Oftentimes that's not the case. The idea that families have the primary responsibility for paying, that financial aid is there to help, fill in the gap. And an expected family contribution right now is lowered if there are more than one, child in college. That is one of the items that is changing in that 24-25 year. So for example, let's say a family has one student in college, and let's say their expected family contribution was $10,000. If they had 2 students in college, the expected family contribution would be $5,000 for one child and $5,000 for the other. But that is changing in that 24-25 year. It's going to be up to institutions to determine how they're going to navigate that. I think this might be one of the reasons why they've kind of pushed off making those changes, the Department of Education, because that legislation came through at the end of December. And this is going to take a lot of work to kind of figure out and navigate through. And I'm glad that they are taking that time and kind of pushing that change off a little bit. If you're interested, there's an EFC calculator on MEFA.org, so you can go there and check that out. So again, the cost of attendance, you subtract the expected family contribution from that cost of attendance, and this determines a student's financial aid eligibility. And that's where an institution comes in and they are kind of filling in there with aid from different sources, from those federal institution, grants, scholarship, and loans and work study. My favorite slide that has never changed is the slide with a sample kind of, financial aid. You will never see a financial aid award that, has this cylinder on it. But it is a good way to kind of visualize and go through. So this institution has a cost of attendance of $45,000. This particular family has an EFC of $5,000. So that kind of goes into the bucket, if you will, first, right? So thinking about the formula, $45,000 cost of attendance, $5,000 expected family contribution, you subtract that. So $40,000 of financial aid eligibility. So this institution is offering the student some grant aid and some scholarship, merit scholarship. That's about $27,500. So that goes in next. Student loans, we saw that for a first-year student, the maximum they can borrow is that $5,500. So most institutions are going to award a student whatever that maximum is, and it's up to the student and family to decide, hey, do I want lower than that? Or, do I want to borrow that full amount? And then this student was also offered some work study. Now, if you have a nice quick math mind and added that up, you would see that it does not equal the $40,000 financial aid eligibility, and that there is what's called kind of unmet need of $5,000. So if all of the costs are that full $45,000, which I said, I've said, that transportation, books, supplies, personal, those are estimates. So it's not a full 45, but for this family, it's the $5,000 expected family contribution, and then potentially another $5,000 that they're needing to kind of meet. This is where I'm just going to circle back to the conversation about outside scholarships and are they worth the work? So if a student applies for a number of outside scholarships and they receive, a $1,000 scholarship, a $500, some of these local scholarships, or maybe a national one that's, is $2,000. If they are really set, on going to an institution and there is this unmet need there, and they are able to bring in some dollars from outside that reduces that unmet need, then for that student and that family, it does become, worth the work that the student puts in to apply for those various scholarships. So the unmet need in EFC, is the family's responsibility. So something great, if you haven't already, or if you are the parent of, a junior or younger, is looking at each institution's net price calculator. And even, this is the perfect time as well for anyone in that fall of senior year as well, because it's still really just like doing research and narrowing down. Every institution is required to have a net price calculator. It's not always the most easy to find. So if you go to an institution's website, just search net price calculator and you should get right to it. It's going to ask questions about your finances. So you want to answer those as honestly as possible, because the output from that is only as good as what you're putting in. So have your 2020 tax return there, asset information. If an institution awards merit aid, they may ask some academic questions like GPA or things like that. So you can provide that. And this is going to give an estimate of net college price. And what that means is net price is defined as cost of attendance. So again, not just the billed or direct cost, but also those unbilled. So the cost of attendance less just grants and scholarships that students in the year that has just kind of is starting in college right now. So that last awarding year, what those students received as far as an average. So this average net price. So it gives you a sense of, what does that 1 year cost? Because oftentimes you look at a cost of attendance and you might think immediately like, we can't go, that cost is too much. So it is very important and worthwhile to look at what would it look like someone that, looks like this family financially. What did a student receive in basically grant and scholarship aid from this institution? So it's helpful. The next two slides, and we're almost at the end, but the next two slides just looking at award letters and how you can really see a variety. I started the presentation talking about it depends, and that continues through really every point of the kind of financial aid process. For this example, just kind of for ease, we have kept the same cost of attendance, the same expected family contribution, and the same total financial aid eligibility for each of these three colleges. But you can see that, we've got college A here, that there's no unmet need, and the majority of funding is coming out of grants and scholarships. And then college B and C, there is some unmet need here. Some people might call that, a gap, and those vary. And perhaps, it could even be that college C was that the student was late in getting their application in, and maybe that is causing the larger unmet need, or it's just a product of not every institution has the same level of funding to be able to provide, and they have to spread it across all of their students. And so you're going to see differences. That's something that's kind of 100%. You will see differences in the financial aid packages across institutions. This slide, it gets me so, it makes me upset because, and the point here is don't just look at that total line. So in blue, the total, they're all providing $35,000. Make sure you're looking at the makeup of it, right? Because that kind of, I'm going to my Crayola days, right? Burnt sienna here, the parent loans. these College B and College C have added in a parent loan into the listing of available funding. Now, a parent certainly can borrow funding, but that is not automatic, right? Like the student loan where it's like they are able to borrow that. They don't need to go through any sort of credit check. A parent has to apply, has to be approved, et cetera. So make sure you know what and look at each particular line in a financial aid award. Paying what's due, and I believe we just have about 3 slides left. So, you know, as with, you know, many purchases we may have, whether it's, you know, a car, you know, a home, and then looking at college, oftentimes, you know, we might be making payments from a variety of sources. So perhaps it's past income, right? So maybe there's some student saving that's going into that, or parent, you know, a college savings, and that past income. Perhaps some of it is coming out of present income, so current wages. Most institutions, if not all, have payment plans available, which is very helpful. So rather than paying in the fall and paying in the spring, they will break out into monthly payments, and it might be, you know, 10 payments that would be made across the year rather than 2. And then perhaps some future income. So loans, and those might be private, they might be federal. And it doesn't have to be from one of these buckets, right? Thinking about, you know, how you might be able to best utilize from all 3 sources. And you can talk with the financial aid office, you can talk with MEFA if you need help in kind of figuring that out. I think this is a great slide to include, is just the idea of having a conversation as a family, right? So here are some bullet points that might be ones that you want to think about, right? So for a student, hey, does it make sense for our family or our student maybe starting at a community college, and there could be some savings there, considering the number of children you will be sending to college. So often, particularly that first year, so much is focused on that first year, and just remembering that it is, you know, a 4-year endeavor. Oftentimes, could be 2 years, but could be more than that as well. So thinking, you know, a little more broadly than just the kind of laser focus of like, sometimes I've met with, it's like, can we make this 1 year work? Well, if it's difficult to make 1 year work, you know, reach out to the financial aid office. Is there more they can provide? Look at other options within other schools as well. Looking at what does a loan payment look like? If you're deciding, yep, we're going to do this, and the student might take on additional loans aside from the federal student loans, what does that monthly payment look like? What are they thinking of possibly doing as a career, and what does that average income look like, and can it support you know, a monthly payment of that size? Is a student considering grad school? Looking at the net price. So again, I just think this is a great slide and reminder that it's so important to you know, have these kind of kitchen table conversations. So in Massachusetts, there are some options. The mass transfer, it's a transfer from community college to a 4-year public, which can make college a little more affordable. Excuse me, I can tell that I'm going on too much because I am needing to take a sip of water. So there are some kind of guaranteed credit transfers as well as tuition credit. So definitely something to look into, the mass.edu and then /mass transfer. And then, you know, a tuition break. So if there's a reduction for out-of-state tuition at New England schools for certain programs. So if there's a program that isn't offered here in the state, there are breaks for students who go out of state to a state institution in another state. So I'm not going to read out that whole web address there, but something that is being provided to you, the slide, so you can look into that. I think this is the last slide. So some free resources. So FAFSA Day. I am lucky enough to be one of the tri-chairs of FAFSA Day Massachusetts. And it is something where we provide free assistance to families in the Commonwealth for completing the FAFSA. Typically, we have done in person, and oftentimes we are at local high schools or colleges where we utilize computer rooms and computer stations. But last year we were fully virtual, obviously, as just about everything was. And we have decided to, at least for the first half of the year, provide some virtual resources again, but we have increased those. So we will do a presentation in next week, October 13th, and it goes line by line through the FAFSA. But we're additionally doing some sessions where it's just kind of breakout rooms. Families can come in if they have just one question or they want someone to just sit with them, because that was the benefit and the beauty of that being in person. Sometimes people just want to know that there's someone right there that they can just ask a question. So we're working on that, but there's information on fafsaday.org. And then we have educational opportunity centers here in Massachusetts where they provide free financial aid help. So that's another website there, Mass Edco, where you can go and seek out some advice. I lied, I thought that was the last one, but I think this is a new slide this year when I was going through. So kind of staying on track through senior year. I know, and again, I have a student myself that is going through this, and it is, it's actually a benefit for me to kind of go through that as a parent now, but it all can feel so overwhelming. So kind of taking this and taking a breath and attending, sessions like this, asking questions, but, we're here in the fall of senior year, potentially like retaking SAT, ACT, make sure letters of recommendation are all secured, finalizing that essay. I actually just was saying to my daughter, this morning, hey, don't forget, we're getting through, into mid-October now, attending this kind I'm not going to read through all of these, and I know these slides were provided for you, but use this kind of as a guide to kind of help you through the year. And there's an extended timeline here that's referenced at the bottom. So go ahead and get an FSA ID if you don't have one. Again, for the student and at least one parent. 100% research deadlines and required applications. I cannot stress enough of putting that down, whether it's on paper, whether it's electronically, so you can track that. Register for webinars. I know that MEFA has always offered like an after the acceptance webinar, which probably seems far off, but that's more kind of in like an April timeframe. But you've sat through this presentation. It's a lot of information to absorb. In April, when you actually have award letters in front of you, there might be some things that you think, oh, what was it that was said in that presentation? And so to have a chance later in the year to circle back kind of at that after point, read MEFA's blogs. They always have good information provided there as well. And then connect with MEFA on social media, because they're always posting good content. I follow them myself, I have for years. It's always great stuff. I believe that's it. So are there any lingering questions? I kind of have seen some questions come up. I just see numbers, but then I see, Julie, you must be answering those, because then I see a 2 go up and then I see it disappear. But are there any lingering questions?
Yeah, so I was trying to keep up, Amy, and I think we got everyone's questions answered, which is great. And you were so thorough. And what you're seeing now is a lot of comments coming in just saying, thank you so much. This was really helpful. One person said, I feel so much less anxious. That's just exactly what we want to hear,
Yeah.
right? So that's great. I'm just going to ask you one question that's left here. And because a few people did ask similar questions as we were going along. So I thought maybe you could just talk about the importance of, getting this, not waiting to do this part. So someone asked, once getting into college, is there still a chance to apply for financial aid? So maybe you can just talk about the importance.
Yeah, so I'm gonna make an assumption, but that means like, hey, I didn't apply and now I'm in, do I still have that opportunity? So my answer is going to be, it depends, right? So absolutely go ahead and apply, reach out to the financial aid office, ask them. And I would hope that most institutions will provide the student that opportunity. But it may be that some institutions, again, because they have a limited pot of money, they may not have some funding. On the federal side, loans are always going to be available, but if you've been admitted, you have not yet applied, 100% reach out to each of those institutions and talk to them and just, kind of plead your case, and hopefully they allow you to apply. I know in my own institution and my past institution, we would take applications and we're gonna work with families.
That's great. Well, I think, let me just look right here in the chat. That chat. I think we're good. Someone just asked if you get estimated funding before you apply. So maybe you can just talk about that.
Yeah. So when I talked about the net price calculator, that's something that at least gives you some sort of preview just into the grant and scholarship aid that someone who applied last year would have received, who looked kind of like you financially, and if there's merit aid too, academically. But typically there's not, an estimate that would be before you apply. But yeah, so it really would be like a net price calculator is probably your best bet for and sense of information. And again, it's just going to be scholarship and grant aid.
So I think we're good. So I want to say thank you, Amy, so much. And
sorry, I went long again.
For, participating and engaging and asking great questions. And good luck with all of it. And as Amy shared, there are lots of resources, lots of help to help you all the way along. Thank you. And everyone have a good night.
Bye.